guys, it's Olivie Blake, and this is me not writing. So I didn't even bother getting a beverage today. It's going to be kind of a quick day. Not too much internet activity this week, so I just figured I'd tell you a little bit about what is going on today, International Women's Day, and also I have to go to the gym. So we're just going to be pretty quick about this. I'm going to read you a little bit of a story, tell you what's going on, and then we'll be good to go. I should probably drink some water, though. If you haven't had any water, you should drink some water. That is a reminder to both of us. Okay, so first thing, this is currently what I'm reading, Henry and June by Anais Nin. It's incredible. It is literary erotica. It's very exciting. If you want to read along, Aurora Sinistra and I are both reading it. So I kind of jokingly was like, oh, you guys should join our erotic book club. But I'm like mostly not joking. So if you want to read this month, and then I will tell you what I guess we're going to read next month. I think I might have some trouble scraping things up. I want to pick out things that are literary, not commercial. Obviously, there is amazing commercial erotica that we could find. The romance genre is incredible. So, if I can't find anything literary, we'll just do that. But anyway, that's what we're doing right now. Henry and June, it's incredible. If you've been anywhere near my social media, you probably know I'm reading this because I'm obsessed with it. It also makes me feel really inadequate as a writer. These are her journals. Yeah. So today is International Women's Day. I am dressed for the occasion and that I have been working all day and I'm wearing this tank top and I look like this. So there. Okay. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the story that I'm writing for Which Way, La Petite Mort, meaning a little death, meaning the French word for an orgasm. It's very clever, don't worry about it. Basically, my editor, who is amazing, asked me to write a story in like 3 to 5 installments, basically. And I was kind of wondering what was going to come next after my holiday story, which is, it was a very tropey, like, girl comes home, fake relationship. And she goes, I really want to do vampires in New Orleans. And I was like, okay, well, that's great. That vibe is amazing. But I don't want to write vampires unless I can write a female vampire. I think there's a lot of, obviously male vampires are a very been there, done that kind of place. And, I write romance, so even though New Orleans is totally different and, like, wild, I mean, the mythology in New Orleans is crazy. If you've never looked into what is, like, going on there, I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot of supernatural, paranormal going on there, and it has been really exciting. I did kind of a lot of research, actually, going into this, and a lot of the characters in the story are based on New Orleans lore. Delphine LaLaurie is in it. The Count of Saint Germain, which you might know about if you have read Outlander or watched, I guess. I don't know. I haven't done either. I watched like part of the first season and I read the first book and then I stopped there. I got as much as I needed. But anyway, and the Casket Girls. I'm not going to go fully into detail into the history of New Orleans. There's a lot, though. If you just Google the Casket Girls, you'll probably fall into a hole for like a couple of hours. So anyway, first of all, I wanted to read this part because I was very insistent on having a female vampire for a reason. I thought it would be much more interesting to have someone who had lived through history in a woman's role, to have been a woman through all these periods of history, to go from having no power to having suddenly this like intense supernatural power, and how would that change her, and how would she be part of the story this way? So the characters in this story are Marisa Marrero, who is Creole, and she has moved to New Orleans because she inherited a house from her aunt, and she doesn't really, in the passage that I'm going to read, she doesn't really know much about anything yet. She still has a lot of questions about who she can trust and what's going on, and et cetera, et cetera. The same questions we all have. And then the Casket Girl, so the vampire in the story, is Elizabeth Clavier. She and Marisa are who are in this scene. They're asking questions about Jack St. Germain, who is based on, so basically I've made the Count of St. Germain, which many people have treated as either, as I mentioned in Outlander, he's a time traveler. He's also been treated as a vampire or possibly a vampire. or an alchemist, and I went with alchemist because I wanted the female vampire. So yes, so I have made the Count of Saint Germain an alchemist, and there's more to it, obviously, but all you need to know is that he's a man and he exists. Don't worry, said a voice behind her, and Marisa jumped, startled to find that Elizabeth was standing behind her. She was dressed this time in an A-line black dress, which she'd worn over sheer black tights with a pair of laced-up patent leather ankle boots. Her hair was up in a French twist, a slim silver barrette holding it in place. Just a beer, Elizabeth clarified, glancing lazily around the room. It's not any kind of magical poison. Marisa blinked. Did you just read your mind? Nope, Elizabeth said, taking a sip of her drink. Her white teeth bit around the narrow straw as she smiled, dark lips curling up with amusement. Which isn't to say I can't, just that I didn't have to. Then she turned away, wandering elsewhere, and Marisa turned to follow, hurrying in her wake. Wait, Elizabeth. Chasing after me, I see, Elizabeth noted without stopping, though she was walking slowly enough, strutting, Marisa would say, or perhaps sashaying, that Marisa could catch up to her. Thought you might. Is Jack not doing it for you, then? She sounded amused, like it was a joke she'd tell someone else later. Yeah, well, about him, Marisa began uncertainly, and Elizabeth sighed, falling to a sudden halt and turning to scrutinize Marisa's look of discomfort. I told you not to trust him, Elizabeth said with a shrug, but it would be extremely unsportsmanlike for me to tell you why. Unsportsmanlike? Yes, very, Elizabeth confirmed, and then turned her attention back to the crowd, catching the eye of a young man who winked at her from across the bar. Elizabeth smiled slowly, white teeth slipping against red lips again, and gave him a small wave. It appeared to be a flirtation that had been going on since earlier in the night. Said Marisa, and Elizabeth beckoned the man over with a tilt of her head, so subtly flirtatious Marisa was immediately filled with envy. Elizabeth, whatever else she was an expert in seduction, and though Marisa wasn't entirely certain what Elizabeth intended, she could see seduction was fundamentally what this was. Look, if you could just tell me, why you warned me against him. Well, Elizabeth said, flashing Marisa an exasperated glance, if you insist on having this conversation right now. I do, Marisa said staunchly. Then you'll have to come help me with a little errand. Hi, she said to the incoming man, slipping her tongue between her lips. Hope you don't mind me being so forward. Not at all, said the man, grinning. He had exceedingly moosed hair, an expensive suit, and what was surely a false tan, Marisa noted. She wasn't sure whether to be repulsed by him or worried for his safety. I love strong women, he said. Elizabeth nudged Marisa, who jumped, startled. That, she murmured in Marisa's ear with a little glance of conspiracy, is code for, I hate strong women, so just tuck that one away. Learned that very quickly, she added, all the while continuing to smile at the man, who seemed rapidly more enamored with her. What's your name, darling? Chad, said the man. What a beautiful name, Elizabeth remarked, taking Chad's hand and leading him back to the stairs. Marisa hung back, unsure what to do, until Elizabeth stopped to roll her eyes, giving Marisa an arched brow of impatience. Come on, then. You wanted answers, didn't you? It was probably a terrible idea, but it was what she had come for. Marisa hurried to follow as Elizabeth took Chad outside, making their way to a darkened corner in the back alley. 2 or 3 cats shuffled hurriedly away, with nothing left but silence in their absence. It seemed that Chad either couldn't look away from Elizabeth, or wouldn't. He took no interest in Marisa or where they were going, and merely permitted himself to be led. Now, tell me, Elizabeth murmured to Chad, nudging him against the back wall of a nearby restaurant. You were here yesterday with a young woman, weren't you? She toyed with his tie, adding, pretty, petite girl, red hair, about my size. Oh, sweetheart, come on, said Chad, dismissing her with a flap of his hand. Jealousy isn't a good look. How about a smile, he asked, reaching out to curl a hand around Elizabeth's cheek. Elizabeth, unlike Chad, hadn't forgotten Marisa's presence. Elizabeth arched a brow over her shoulder, sparing Marisa a little gesture of, I told you so. What happened to her? Elizabeth asked innocently, turning back to Chad, and he shrugged. She wasn't you, sweetheart, he said, adding smoothly, I've never felt anything like this before. And to that, Elizabeth's smile turned cold, her dark eyes rising to meet his with something that gave Marisa an irrepressible chill. Tell me the truth, Elizabeth said, and though her voice hadn't audibly changed, there was something in the command that hadn't been there before. Now, Marisa could somehow feel the effects of Elizabeth's will filling all the little pressure points of her body, nudging into weak spots at the back of her knees and swelling at her temples like a headache. Marisa felt distinctly uncomfortable, unsettled, and trapped, as if she couldn't push away something that closed too tightly around her airway. It was obvious that Chad, too, was suffering a heightened degree of Marisa's own symptoms. He seemed to fight it for a minute, grimacing, before grounding out, "I fucked her and didn't call. It was just sex." "And me?" Elizabeth asked, batting her lashes. "You're just sex, too," slid through Chad's teeth, though he looked a little disarmed by having said it. Elizabeth sighed, leaning towards him. "Right. And tell me, Chad, did you even bother to make sure your guests from last night finished?" By now, Chad was aware something wasn't right. The entrancement he must have felt at first, Elizabeth's natural charm, mixed with something else she clearly possessed, had obviously been comfortable enough, but this clearly wasn't. He looked with panic at Marisa, blinking, before his jaw wrenched open for a single word. "No." Elizabeth's dark lips twitched, then stilled. "I thought not," she said, and then Chad's pulse really began to race, evidence of it obvious in the way his veins pulsed at his neck. A troubling sight, Marisa thought uncomfortably, particularly once Elizabeth's dark eyes fell to his throbbing carotid, her thumb tracing smoothly over the evidence of blood. "Wait," Marisa said, and Elizabeth turned to look at her, irritated. "About Jack." "Can't this wait?" Elizabeth asked, her hand tightening momentarily around Chad's throat until he choked, wheezing a little in opposition. "I told you, I had a little errand to run." "I mean, I see that, but I'd kind of rather you didn't kill him," Marisa said uncertainly, and Elizabeth rolled her eyes. "Your opposition's been noted," she said, and then sighed, releasing Chad briefly with a command of, "Sit." Obediently, Chad sat, his legs collapsing under him. "Stay," Elizabeth said coolly, and he glared at her, mutinous, but obliged as she turned back to Marisa, folding her arms over her chest. "You have 5 minutes," Elizabeth said flippantly, "so ask." Probably the best offer Marisa was going to get. "Who is Jack?" she asked. "A liar," Elizabeth said, shrugging. "Next question." "What do you mean?" "Everything about him is stolen," Elizabeth said with a scoff, his name included. "Well," Marisa considered, frowning, "he says he's an alchemist, so—" "He is," Elizabeth said, "among other things." "Liar," she repeated, ticking them off on her fingers, "along with demon killer, vampire killer, regular killer." "Who did he—" Marisa began and winced. "How did he, why, I guess, did he—" "It's really not my story to tell," Elizabeth sighed with an element of annoyance. "And anyway, he's gone soft in recent years. As far as I know, Jack hasn't killed anyone or anything in almost a century, though that's at least partially my doing." She glanced down at Chad, winking at him, and then turned back to Marisa. "So if you're worried about him hurting you, he won't," she said with a shrug. "He'll just trick you into something, or trap you. He's clever that way." "Are you two friends?" Marisa asked. "No," Elizabeth said, and then 2 more questions. "Well, you made a point of warning me against him," Marisa reminded her with a frown, "so I guess I just want to understand if I'm in danger or if he's—" She hesitated. "I want to know if I can trust him, I suppose." "Well, you can't," Elizabeth said tartly, "but obviously you're going to. The unfortunate thing about Jack is that he does know a lot," she grudgingly permitted. "And he can be useful, provided you set some boundaries. He's very powerful, very skilled, and he can answer more of your questions than I can. Just know that when he gives you an answer, he is almost certainly restricting most of the truth. Be careful with relying on him. The Count of Saint Germain was the first to pay the price for trusting Jack, and I doubt you'll be the last." "But," Marisa frowned, "I thought Jack was the Count." "He is," Elizabeth said. "But he is now," Elizabeth corrected impatiently. "The man born to the title of Count and the one who eventually went down in history are 2 different men. One of them is wealthy and talented, skilled and learned, and in possession of a valuable secret, and the other, as I mentioned, is a liar. Though a very handsome one," she added, grinning down at Chad, who gave her another murderous look of displeasure. "And beautiful people will ruin your life, won't they, Chad?" Marisa could see she was losing Elizabeth's attention. "Okay, sure, but hold on," she recalled, swallowing. "When you say he's a killer, do you mean—" "Hey, Chad," Elizabeth said, withdrawing the silver barrette from her hair and sliding away a piece of it, revealing it to have been a slim stiletto knife. "Hold this, would you?" Chad struggled not to raise his hand, but it was a matter of seconds, blinks, before he gradually gave in, his fingers shakily unfurling one by one. Even Marisa, subjected to Elizabeth's abilities purely by proximity, had to fight from lifting her hand and accepting the knife herself as Chad's hand hovered unwillingly for Elizabeth's perusal. "Thanks," Elizabeth said, smacking the stiletto into his palm. "Be careful," she advised with a laugh, and Marisa watched Chad's eyes widen as his own hand raised the knife, ostensibly without his permission, to his throat. "That's a good boy," Elizabeth murmured. "Just hold it there." "Elizabeth," Marisa cut in, swallowing. "Look, I want to believe you, but—" "He's a lost cause, you know," Elizabeth remarked thoughtfully. Marisa blinked. "Who, Jack?" "No, Chad. Focus," Elizabeth snapped, and in response, Marisa felt her brain rattle a little inside her head. "Chad is never going to learn." "He's a lost cause," she murmured, bending down to look him in the eye, along with every other man like him. "Aren't you?" she said softly, and as Chad swallowed, the blade he held to his throat drew a thin, shallow line, no deeper than a paper cut. Briefly, Elizabeth smiled. Then she leaned forward, slipping her tongue along the tiny beads of crimson, and Chad shuddered violently, lurching away from her touch. "What's wrong, baby?" Elizabeth asked him, employing a delicate tone of hurt. "Don't you like that?" "Elizabeth," Marisa said hoarsely, but Elizabeth's lips were on Chad's throat again. "Up to you," Elizabeth said to Chad's neck, her teeth grazing lightly over his skin in a motion so sensual that even Marisa shuddered with inadvisable longing. "If I bite you," Elizabeth said, "it'll take longer. I haven't had a proper meal in some time, and believe me, darling, I'm starving." Elizabeth's tongue slipped out over the lobe of Chad's ear, and he forced his eyes shut. "See her?" Elizabeth asked, wrenching his jaw with one hand to forcefully turn his attention to Marisa. "She's pretty, isn't she? Look at those long legs, look at that skin, those eyes. Tempting, isn't she?" Elizabeth mused. "Oh, you and I see similar things when we look at her, I'm sure, but I see something you don't. I see something even she doesn't see, but Jack probably does. Because Jack's not an idiot, is he? Even if he's hardly better than you." Marisa inhaled sharply, unsure what to do with that information. Then, abruptly, Elizabeth jerked Chad's face towards her again, one hand clawed around his jaw. "Me or the knife," she said, voice cold again, and Chad's breath quickened. "Your choice." Marisa was fairly certain she should run, especially because Chad couldn't, and what would happen when Elizabeth was done? Only there was something darkly enchanting about Elizabeth's silken voice. She was crouched in the darkened alley over a helpless man, and still, Marisa couldn't look away. "Go ahead," Elizabeth said, coaxing Chad with a dangerous quiet. "Tell me, darling, how do you want your death?" Chad struggled, glaring at her for a long moment, but having been given permission, his lips eventually parted. "Fuck you, bitch," he spat, and in a startling motion, he slit his own throat, the blood rushing from his carotid to dribble down his tie before he immediately slumped down, limp, and gargled up the last of his air. Marisa turned away, sickened, and heard Elizabeth rise to her feet. "They always say that," Elizabeth lamented with a facetious sigh, shaking her head. "Men, honestly." "Anyway, was that all?" she asked Marisa, who immediately took a step back, stumbling in retreat. "Aren't you," Marisa said, struggling not to vomit or cry, "aren't you going to eat him? Or she winced. "Drink his blood? Or—" "Nah," Elizabeth said, shrugging. "This?" she said, kicking at Chad's lifeless foot, and Marisa flinched again. "Your body's a temple, Marisa," she advised, tossing her hair over one shoulder and turning in the opposite direction. "Don't fill it with toxic shit." So anyway, that's Elizabeth Clavier. And so that's the story that I'm currently writing for Which Way. I'm not sure if it's going to be available when it's complete, maybe. Otherwise, you can find subscription information on my website, and I can also tell you which issues the story is in. But anyway, the point is, this is the story I'm currently writing. Today is International Women's Day. I guess just as a reminder, the world wants us to be rivals. They want us to be competitors. But we should be supporting each other. We should be building each other up. I know that there are definitely people who are privileged enough to not perceive the inequality between men and women. because their lives haven't been affected by it. But as a reminder, whether your life is affected by it or not, it's still a truth. And we as a gender still have a long way to go. None of us are so privileged that we can just ignore it. We're part of a collective, I guess, and hopefully we don't lose sight of that because we are only going to progress if we do so together, if we build each other up. That was not my most beautiful speech, but there it is. Anyway, next week, if you want to get back to questions, we can do that. I think I had a romance question or like a relationship question that I just didn't address today. So if you have anything, go ahead and ask me on whatever social media you prefer. And yeah, I gotta go to the gym now. So this has been me, Olivie Blake, not writing. Oh wait, just as a heads up, remember how I was icing my foot? I have tendonitis, and it's not in my foot. Well, it is. It's in the thing that connects my foot to my calf. So it's like right here. So anyway, just letting you guys know that's the update. It's tendonitis. Please stretch. Also, if you ever get tendonitis, then you just have to take ibuprofen, and then you have to ice it for 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off for like a couple of hours a day. Okay, that's all. Now it's been me, Olivie Blake, not writing. It's been me, Olivie Blake, going to the gym. And I'll see you next week.